This is a southwest facing slope where we're practicing an agroforestry system with nitrogen fixers and grazing in between the nitrogen fixers on like a fairly steep slope that was really beat up. A lot of the soil had been lost off this slope. So for about 10 to 15 years before I moved to this place, and then for about 5 years after I moved here, this slope wouldn't grow any grass. It really didn't grow anything for the most part, except some mosses and some like 1 foot tall trees. It took about 10 years to grow. So it had no productivity. There was almost very little biodiversity and almost no biomass. What we did was we finally figured out how to use water properly on this slope, and we made on-contour swale mounds. And despite all of our efforts for about 5 years before we cut these swales, at seeding and even spraying biological inoculants onto the slope, nothing really changed until we cut here, put the material here, made the on-contour swale mounds. And what that did was stop the water, right? So the water now runs across the slope and has to stop and percolate into the ground. So now the water that lands here goes into the ground and percolates down the slope in the soil, which made us realize, once we saw this biological activity, I mean, more biomass is produced now in 1 year than was produced in 10 years, or many times more. I mean, in 1 year now we've managed to graze it and scythe it 3 times in 1 year, when there was nothing to graze or mow for 10 years here. So now in 1 year we could harvest 3 times. So the biodiversity and biomass just went through the roof with this action. And what it made us realize was that the water was all running off the slope. Even though we get rain all the time, in Vermont we don't tend to think there's drought happening. But really there is drought happening on certain slopes all the time, because where the soils are beat up and where they're steep and where it's southwest facing and it's droughty. That was big news to me, because I had never assumed this slope was in drought because we get so much rain. So now that we're slowing the water down and percolating it, the ecosystem has started to produce and started to actually kick into gear. It is, guys, this is year 3 for these hazelnuts here. You know, this slope would not have supported this plant growth, and this hedgerow of hazelnuts now is, it's growing pretty abundantly. I mean, there's a lot of life coming out of all layers here, including the overstory, which is in hazelnut. And they also benefit from the nitrogen that's being fixed uphill. So we have our nitrogen fixers high on the slopes where it tends to be least fertile, and then we tend to get more fertility down slope. So we put our heavier feeders down low on the slope, like the hazelnuts. This is ecosystem restoration, but it's also food production, it's also agriculture. It's both at the same time. Even if we decide these plants aren't the plants we want, the process that's happening here is one of increasing value in the landscape. Let's build soil while we get a yield. So the sea berry is a good example of a plant that can do both. As a food, it's very good. It's really a food medicine. I mean, most powerful foods are medicine too, but this is really a nutraceutical quality berry, very high in vitamin E and essential fatty acids, really high in anti-cancer compounds to protect against the sun, protect against radiation sickness. It's been used. So it's a very powerful plant, not just for our health, but also for the health of the soil. In this one right here, there we are. That's the beauty of swales and ponds and rice paddies, is they're essentially stormwater detention basins, right? They're all storing the flow of water, keeping it out of the watershed, but then utilizing that fertility to grow food. So they're edible stormwater detention basins, essentially. That's really, I mean, we should have learned that, like growing up in school, like see all these photos of rice paddies around the world. They're just there's edible stormwater detention basins, and that's like performs so many ecosystem services. It's a way of thinking about managing the ecosystems and the landscapes in terms of, if we have land systems that are slowing water and infiltrating water, we can manage these pulses and these shocks to the system in a really big way. And that's how we think of swales, ponds, and paddies, is as shock absorbers, right? Because it's all about pulses. It will be like too dry and they'll be too wet. And we go through these cycles, you know, up, down, up, down. So the best farming systems level out those pulses, and everything in the system acts as a shock absorber. Essentially what we're doing here is just growing a staple crop, which is very important, a very important staple. It's a carbohydrate crop, so you don't need, it can store for years. You can basically live on it. You don't need a root cellar or a freezer or a refrigerator to keep it. You can just put up as much rice as you can and just put it away for years. And where growing rice, the amazing thing about rice is it can be grown in this shock absorbing type of way in a paddy. So the rice is pretty important, but the really important thing here is the paddies. In agriculture, that's not constantly losing its soil because it's a depression, it's a stormwater detention basin. So everything that comes in stays in here. These really never overflow. You think about your vegetable garden, you have to constantly add fertility because you're always losing stuff off of it. You know, the phrase where water runs make it walk, that's a common permaculture phrase, but it really gets to the point where if you're doing that, it means water that used to travel, let's say 1,500 feet from top to bottom like a skier would, you know, straight across the fall line, now has to, on this property, go a mile and sit in paddies and ponds and little pools and go through swales. On every foot of that travel way, it's offering value. In the whole northeastern U.S. and the whole eastern, really east of the Mississippi, and a lot of the rest of the world, but especially this part of the world, we get more water than we can deal with in pulses, and then we don't have water for a while. And when we get those pulses, we waste away most of its value. Most of it's lost. So, you know, it goes right out the Chesapeake, goes, you know, right out the Hudson, right out our major watersheds into the ocean. We're losing most of our nitrogen into the ocean with every storm. And there's just no need. You know, with small-scale earthworks happening all over, we can be, boom, just like absorbing all that, like taking the hit. And we know, like, conservationists are familiar with that from an ecological perspective, like with wetlands. But where does that meet productive working landscapes that can support people, that can feed people? Every year, year after year, there's only 2 to 3 days of food on shelves and stores. So if that flow, that really delicate, fragile system breaks down, the shelves are empty. So food storage is, you know, something that is kind of smart to do, and it's not hard. It doesn't cost a lot of money at all. Actually, it probably saves you money if you store some food. And so if you're growing food, growing a carbohydrate, a staple crop that stores, it's kind of a no-brainer from just a basic food security standpoint.
Oh yeah, they're over here. They're just sitting in the shade.
For Icelandic sheep, which we've had for about 2 years now, and we're going to be breeding them this year because we really need about 8 of them to keep up with the 6 or so acres of pasture that we have. But everything's pasture that we have in production. It's all pasture. So even where we're growing fruit trees and, you know, berries and nuts and fuel wood hedges, that's all pastured because it all wants to grow grass too next to the plants. So that's where we're trying to work on developing a lot of mixed pasture, like mixed pasture systems, agroforestry systems, or silvopasture systems where you're growing woody perennials, like tree crops, berry crops, alongside animal crops, you know, essentially, integrating them. And it's better for everything when you're doing that because they're cycling the biomass. Otherwise, you got to mow or scythe, and you're not actually cycling the biomass. And it's best for all of this stuff to go through an animal and come out of soil, you know, in manure. Otherwise, you're just, you know, maybe you can harvest the hay and compost it and then bring all that fertility back out. That's not very practical. For the most part, we want to graze every square inch of our system that we can. You know, intensive rotational grazing as a system, it's a really basic idea that when you take a lot of animals and have them in a small amount of space and move them really often, you get the most soil building happening because they become as least selective as possible. They eat as many of the plants as possible, so you don't end up with a crop of weeds, a crop of plants that's not good for the animals. Like if you just leave a bunch of animals in one paddock all the time, which is how most grazing's done. That's really bad for the land and bad for the animals too. These animals move around and they touch the one piece of land just once or twice the whole season. So there's a lot of rest and then there's a lot of intensive eating down. And that causes a lot of root dieback, which is building soil. The plant's roots die back, it leaves organic matter in the soil, and that's you building soil.